Have you ever noticed that when you start digging into ancient history, like way back, especially the religious stuff, it feels like there are these massive gaps, like whole chunks are missing.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a puzzle with a bunch of pieces gone.
No, exactly. It's like so many texts, they've either vanished completely, been declared like forbidden or something, or just like deliberately hidden away.
Yeah, tucked away in some vault somewhere.
And that's got to be frustrating for anyone who's, actually interested in figuring out what was really going on back then, right? Like you.
Absolutely. Especially when you realize that the development of like religious ideas and beliefs, it wasn't this neat and tidy straight line.
Right, more like a tangled mess.
Totally. It's full of these twists and turns and ideas that got pushed aside and voices that were basically silenced, either intentionally or they just faded away over time. And that's what makes it so fascinating. You have to keep searching, keep discovering, keep looking at things from different perspectives to even try and fill in those gaps.
Okay, so that brings us to what we're really diving into today, something you found particularly interesting. The Book of Enoch.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole story of how it was rediscovered through the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is just incredible in itself. We've got a whole bunch of sources here that shed light on this ancient text and all the mystery surrounding it. It's going to be fun to unpack all of this.
Yeah, it really highlights this amazing intersection, between ancient literature, this totally unexpected archaeological discovery, and theological questions that people have been wrestling with for centuries. It's mind-blowing, really.
Yeah. It really is. So the Book of Enoch was kind of like on the fringes for a long time, but the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery really brought it back into the spotlight, not just for scholars, but for anyone who's interested in these sorts of things,
Yeah, totally. It's like, boom, here it is again.
Yeah. So what we're aiming to do today is like really unpack this whole narrative. We'll try and answer some big questions. Who was Enoch? What made finding parts of his book among the Dead Sea Scrolls so significant? What are the main stories and ideas within the Book of Enoch itself? We're also going to delve into how historically accurate it might be, its kind of complicated relationship with religious authorities over the centuries, and even touch on some of the more out there theories that are associated with it.
Yeah.
Just to give you the full picture.
The whole shebang.
Yeah, exactly. The whole shebang. But without getting bogged down in too much detail.
Yeah, keep it snappy.
So to kick things off, let's start by looking at this whole mystery surrounding Enoch. Now, if you flip back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, you get this really brief mention of him. It just says, Enoch walked with God, and God took him, and that's it. It's like, boom, gone. And it's this sudden and quite mysterious disappearance, isn't it, that has really captured the imagination of both Jewish and Christian traditions for centuries.
Yeah, it's one of those things that really gets you thinking. That verse, Genesis 5:24, it's so short and simple, but it's incredibly powerful, precisely because it doesn't tell you much. It just hints at something extraordinary happening to Enoch, something that sets him apart from ordinary human experience, And this lack of detail, this mystery, it actually created the perfect space for later, more elaborate stories and interpretations to develop within both Judaism and Christianity.
Right, like people were trying to fill in the blanks.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. You can see how this one tiny verse has sparked so much thought and creativity over the centuries.
It's like a seed that grew into this huge tree of ideas. And it's interesting to note that his significance seems to go beyond those traditions too, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of surprising how much cultural reach Enoch has. Like in Islam, he's often seen as the same fist as Idris, a prophet described in the Quran as righteous, who was raised to a high station. This idea of a wise sage from before the Great Flood, it seems to be shared across these different faiths.
What's really fascinating is this cross-cultural connection, The link between Enoch and Idris really emphasizes this shared lineage of prophets and wise figures across the Abrahamic faiths. And the Quran's description of Idris being truthful and elevated by God, it aligns perfectly with the Enochian tradition of a righteous person who was super close to the divine. It's like they're telling different versions of the same story, but with different cultural flavors.
It's like this ancient echo that's rippled across different cultures and religions, this idea of a chosen one who walks with God. And then you have these esoteric and Gnostic traditions that link him to Hermes Trismegistus, who's often associated with universal wisdom.
Right. Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, the master of secrets.
Exactly. And sometimes he's even seen as the same person as Thoth, the Egyptian god of knowledge and writing, or Hermes, the Greek messenger god. So it's like Enoch is being elevated to this like universal figure of ancient wisdom, He's not just a prophet. He's like the source of all knowledge.
Precisely. This association with Hermes Trismegistus really elevates Enoch beyond just a religious figure. He becomes this embodiment of profound knowledge, this bridge between the earthly and the divine. It's like, whether you call him Enoch, Idris, or Hermes, the core idea is the same. A dude who ascends to heaven, chats with angels, and brings back crazy knowledge for humanity. And it's interesting to see how this archetype pops up in so many different cultures and traditions, isn't it?
It's like this universal human fascination with the idea of someone who's tapped into this hidden knowledge, this higher wisdom. And across all these traditions, he's pretty consistently presented as Noah's great-grandfather, which is kind of cool, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty consistent thread.
He's this wise figure from before the flood, sometimes even credited with inventing writing or even being the first astronomer.
Like the OG astronomer.
Right, the OG astronomer. So that brings us to the next big thing we need to unpack. The discovery that really changed our understanding of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Can you tell us how this amazing find actually happened? It wasn't exactly a planned archaeological dig, was it?
Oh, not at all. This is one of those historical moments that happened entirely by chance. So picture this. It's either 1946 or 1947. Accounts vary a bit, but this Bedouin shepherd is just chilling, looking for his lost goat near the Dead Sea.
Casually strolling along.
Yeah, just vibing in the desert. And he stumbles across this cave in the Qumran region. Doesn't think much of it. Caves are everywhere. But he decides to peek inside. Maybe his goat is hiding in there.
Taking shelter from the sun.
Right. So he goes in. What does he see? Clay jars. A bunch of them. And inside these jars, guess what?
Ancient treasures.
Bingo. Ancient scrolls, my friend. A whole bunch of them. This dude just stumbled onto one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Total by accident.
That's insane. Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Seriously. It's like the universe was like, hey, you, shepherd dude, go check out that cave. You're going to find something cool. And boy, did he ever.
And it turns out to be this massive collection, right?
Yeah, it's gigantic.
We're talking about almost 1,000 manuscripts dating back centuries before the time of Jesus.
It's mind-blowing. There are about 981 different manuscripts, to be precise. And they date back to the 3rd century BCE all the way to the 1st century CE. That's a huge chunk of time,
Yeah, that's crazy. So what was it about the Dead Sea Scrolls that initially got people so excited?
Well, for starters, they contain some of the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible. That's a big deal for scholars and religious folks alike, They get to see how the text has changed over time.
Like looking back in time at the evolution of the Bible.
Exactly. It's like having a time machine for religious texts. Yeah. But what's even more interesting for our purposes is that they also found a bunch of non-canonical or apocryphal works, like stuff that wasn't included in the official Bible.
The stuff they decided to leave out.
Exactly. And this is where Enoch makes his grand re-entrance.
Ta-da!
They found fragments of the book of 1 Enoch written in the original Aramaic.
No way. In the original language.
Yep. Imagine the excitement among scholars when they saw those fragments.
Well, I bet they were freaking out.
Oh, totally. You see, before the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only complete version of the Book of Enoch that scholars in the West knew about was a translation in Ge'ez. It's an ancient Ethiopian language, still spoken today, and it was preserved by the Ethiopian church.
So like this hidden treasure tucked away in Ethiopia.
Precisely. But then these Aramaic fragments show up in Qumran. Boom. Direct, undeniable proof that the text existed way back in the 2nd century BCE, smack dab in the middle of Jewish society. It completely changed the game,
It's like this missing link suddenly appears.
Exactly. It's like finding a lost piece of a puzzle that you didn't even know was missing.
And it totally validates the Book of Enoch as this ancient and important text. It's not just some late, obscure writing. It was clearly circulating and influencing people way back then.
And not just anyone. It was influencing people who were shaping the religious landscape of their time, the Second Temple period. That's the period right before and during the emergence of Christianity.
That's a crucial point for you to keep in mind. This is the time when those early Christians were developing their beliefs, and Enoch, we now know, was part of that conversation.
Big time. These scrolls were like a window into the diversity of religious thought that was bubbling up back then. They show us how important texts like Enoch were, even though they were later sidelined by the mainstream. It's like a whole hidden library suddenly opened up, and we get to peek inside.
Amazing. So now we have a better grasp of who Enoch was, this almost mythical figure who walked with God. And we know that the Dead Sea Scrolls gave us solid evidence that his book was super old, like older than Christianity old. Now let's dive into the Book of Enoch itself. So it's not just one continuous story, is it? It's more like a collection of different parts, right?
Yeah, it's more like an anthology. Think of it as a collection of ancient writings, kind of like a mixtape. They were eventually compiled into one book.
Okay, like a greatest hits album.
Exactly. Scholars usually break it down into 5 main sections, each with its own unique flavor, kind of like different tracks on that mixtape.
Okay, let's go through them one by one. What's the first section all about?
The first part is called the Book of the Watchers. It's the longest section, taking up the first 36 chapters. It's all about these fallen angels, called Watchers, and Enoch's wild trips through heaven.
Fallen angels? That sounds juicy. What did they do to get kicked out of heaven?
Well, imagine this. These Watchers were sent to Earth by God to, guide and watch over humanity, keep us on the straight and narrow. But they get a little, shall we say, distracted.
Uh-oh, what'd they do?
They started lusting after human women, and they couldn't resist. They ended up mating with them, and that's how the Nephilim were born.
The Nephilim, those are the giants, right?
You got it. The Nephilim are often described as giants or fallen ones. They're the offspring of these forbidden relationships between angels and humans.
So it's like a forbidden love story gone wrong.
Totally. And it's also a fascinating early attempt to grapple with the origins of evil. You know?
Like, where did evil come from? Why is there so much suffering?
Yeah, those big questions. The Book of the Watchers suggests that evil entered the world through these transgressions, these violations of divine boundaries. It set the stage for later theological discussions about sin and its consequences.
So it's not just a cool story about angels and giants, it's actually trying to explain something deeper about human nature and the nature of good and evil.
Exactly. It's exploring those really profound questions about why things are the way they are. And it's not just about these forbidden relationships either. The Watchers also messed up by revealing all sorts of knowledge that was supposed to be kept secret.
Like they spilled the beans on some divine secrets.
Exactly. The book gives us this whole list of forbidden knowledge that the Watchers divulged. We're talking about magic, astrology, how to make weapons, strategies for war, the arts of beauty and cosmetics, even how to create plant poisons.
Wait, so they taught humans how to make weapons?
Yep. Swords, shields, how to work with metal, the whole shebang.
That sounds kind of dangerous.
It was. But on the surface, some of this knowledge might seem beneficial, right? Like learning about astronomy or how to make tools.
Yeah, that could help people advance.
Right, you'd think so.
Mm-hmm.
But the Book of Enoch flips that idea on its head. It portrays the sharing of this knowledge as a major downfall for humanity. It led to violence, corruption, and a decline in morals.
So instead of knowledge being power, it was actually a curse.
In a way, yeah. The introduction of weapons led to bloodshed, magic to immoral practices, and cosmetics to vanity and lust. It's like this domino effect of negativity.
So that's the backstory for the flood then. All that bad stuff going on is what led God to wipe out humanity, right?
You got it. And the Book of Enoch actually gives us a detailed moral explanation for the flood. It lays the blame squarely on the Watchers' transgressions and the destructive influence of the Nephilim.
It's like this whole chain of events. The Watchers lust after human women, they have giant babies, they teach humans all this dangerous stuff, and then boom, the flood comes.
Exactly. It's a cosmic drama unfolding. And Enoch doesn't stop there. It even tells of Enoch predicting Noah's birth long before it happens and describing Noah's special appearance. It's like he's this chosen one, destined to survive the coming catastrophe.
Wow, it's like he's peeking into the future.
He's totally plugged in.
Yeah.
You know, he's got this direct line to the divine. And that sets the stage for the next section of the Book of Parables.
Okay, what's that one all about?
The Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch, as it's sometimes called, is all about visions of the end times and judgments. It's like this apocalyptic roller coaster ride full of symbolism and prophecy.
It sounds intense.
It is, and it's particularly interesting because of its messianic themes. It introduces this mysterious figure who's often compared to the Son of Man, someone who will come to judge the righteous and the wicked.
Like a savior figure.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this imagery pops up later in the New Testament, with Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man. So the Book of Enoch is giving us a glimpse into the messianic expectations that were already circulating centuries before Jesus came on the scene.
That's a mind-blowing connection. So the Book of Enoch is not just telling cool stories, it's actually laying the groundwork for some pretty important religious ideas.
Absolutely. And it's also worth noting that the Book of Parables isn't found in some of the earliest manuscripts, and it wasn't discovered complete at Qumran. So scholars are still debating where it originally fit within the whole Enoch saga.
Okay, so it's like a bonus track on the mixtape.
Kind of, yeah. It adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Okay, what about the next section?
The next one is called the Book of Astronomy, and it's pretty much what it sounds like.
Enoch goes all Neil deGrasse Tyson on us.
He does. This section is all about cosmological knowledge, stuff that Enoch supposedly learned during his trips through heaven. It describes the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars, and even lays out a 364-day calendar system.
A different calendar than the one we use today.
Right. This one's based on the sun, a solar calendar, which was used by some Jewish communities at the time. It's different from the lunar calendar that became dominant later on.
So it's like a glimpse into a different way of understanding time.
Exactly. And it gets even deeper. The Book of Astronomy suggests that the stars are actually governed by angels, and it connects the order of the cosmos with divine law. It's like saying that the whole universe is a reflection of God's will.
It's not just about, like, stars and planets. It's about the spiritual dimension of the cosmos.
Right. It's a blend of science and spirituality.
Cool. Okay, what's next?
The next section is called the Book of Dreams.
Ooh, dreams. Always a good time.
It's a wild ride. The Book of Dreams is all about these symbolic dreams that Enoch had. They offer an allegorical view of world history, but instead of using straight-up narrative, it uses animal metaphors.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of animal metaphors?
Like sheep represent the faithful, small bulls symbolize Israel, and larger, more aggressive animals represent the Nephilim and their descendants.
So it's like a barnyard version of history?
Kinda, yeah. It's a really unique way of telling a story. And these dreams cover a huge sweep of time, from before the flood, through the flood itself, and all the way to what the author envisioned as the Messianic age.
So it's like he's dreaming the future.
In a way, yeah. It's this vision of history unfolding through these vivid, symbolic images.
Pretty cool. And the last section?
The final part is called the Epistle of Enoch.
Epistle, that sounds fancy.
It is. An epistle is basically a letter. And in this case, it's a letter from Enoch to his sons, full of moral instructions, prophecies, and teachings.
Like a dad giving advice to his kids.
Exactly. But this is Enoch, so his advice is like next level.
Divine dad wisdom.
Totally. It's like a guide to living righteously and preparing for the coming judgment and blessings. It's a powerful conclusion to the whole book.
So the Book of Enoch is this whole crazy tapestry of stories, prophecies, visions, and wisdom teachings. It's like a window into a completely different way of seeing the world.
Exactly. And it's amazing to think that this book, which was nearly lost to history, was actually influencing some of the earliest Christians.
Yeah, we often forget that the Bible as we know it wasn't always set in stone, you know?
Right, it was a process.
There was a time when people were reading and debating all sorts of texts, trying to figure out what to include and what to leave out.
It was like a battle of the books, you know?
Okay, so let's talk about the Book of Enoch's historical context for a bit.
You got it.
We know it's old, but how does it connect to other ancient cultures and texts?
That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls come in clutch. You know?
Yeah.
Those Aramaic fragments are the MVPs of this whole story.
MVPs for sure.
They establish, without a doubt, that the Book of Enoch was circulating at least as early as the 3rd century BCE.
That's before Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire.
Yeah, we're talking way back. And most scholars agree that the latest sections were probably written around 100 BCE, which means it's older than the New Testament.
Mind blown. Again.
I know, right? It's crazy to think about.
And there's evidence that some New Testament authors were actually familiar with Enoch, right?
Oh, yeah. Tons of evidence.
Stability.
All right, so the Epistle of Jude straight up quotes from the Book of Enoch, like word for word.
No way. Really?
Yep. And the Epistolary epistles, those are letters attributed to the Apostle Peter. They have allusions to the fallen angel story. So it's clear that Enoch was considered a pretty legit text in those early Christian circles.
It's like they were reading it and thinking, yeah, this makes sense.
Totally. And remember those 11 different fragments of Enoch found at Qumran? That shows you how popular it was in that community. They weren't just reading it, they were copying it, sharing it, discussing it. It was part of their intellectual and spiritual world.
It's fascinating to think that a book that was later deemed apocryphal was actually considered important by some early Christians. It really makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently?
What if Enoch had made it into the official canon?
Yeah, what would Christianity look like today?
That's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down.
Maybe in no time.
For sure. But yeah, it's a reminder that things weren't always as fixed and rigid as they seem today. There was a lot more fluidity and debate in those early days.
So Enoch was part of this vibrant mix of ideas that were circulating in that era. And speaking of mix, you mentioned some parallels with other mythologies, especially with the Watchers and this whole idea of them giving knowledge to humans.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. The Watchers sharing forbidden knowledge. It's a motif that has echoes in other ancient cultures. It's particularly similar to the Mesopotamian myth of the apocryphal, these 7 sages, who were sent by the gods to teach humanity all sorts of stuff.
Like what kind of stuff?
Practical skills like agriculture, writing, architecture, basically how to build a civilization from scratch.
So they were like the original teachers.
Exactly. They were seen as these benevolent figures helping humanity to progress. But the Book of Enoch takes a completely different approach, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's almost the opposite. The Watchers sharing knowledge is portrayed as a bad thing, a source of corruption.
It's a fascinating contrast, and some scholars think this might be intentional.
Like they're deliberately turning the myth on its head.
Exactly. They're taking this familiar idea, this motif of divine beings giving knowledge to humans, and they're reinterpreting it through a Jewish lens. It's like they're saying, yeah, those other cultures might think it's great to get all this knowledge from the gods, but we know better, it leads to trouble.
It's like a subtle dig at their neighbors.
Kinda, yeah. It's a way of asserting their own unique worldview, their own understanding of the relationship between humanity and the divine.
And it's not just the knowledge thing that has parallels. The flood narrative itself is also found in other ancient cultures, isn't it?
Oh yeah, the flood story is a classic. It pops up all over the ancient world. We see versions of it in Sumerian, Babylonian, and Akkadian myths, all with their own local flavor. But what the Book of Enoch does is give a very specific moral reason for this catastrophic event.
It connects it to the actions of the Watchers and the Nephilim.
Exactly. It's not just a random act of God. It's a consequence of human sinfulness, of the corruption that's been unleashed upon the world.
So it's a way of explaining why such a terrible thing happened.
Right. It's providing a theological framework for understanding this ancient myth.
And it's interesting to compare this to, say, Greek mythology, where unions between gods and humans often resulted in heroes and demigods who were generally seen as positive figures, right?
That's a great point. Like Heracles, the son of Zeus, or Perseus who slayed Medusa. These were powerful figures, often celebrated for their deeds, even if they had their flaws. But in the Book of Enoch, the offspring of the Watchers and humans, the Nephilim, are portrayed as agents of chaos and destruction. It's a complete reversal of that Greek ideal.
It's like they're saying mixing with the divine is not a good idea.
Right. It's dangerous, it's corrupting, it leads to all sorts of trouble. It highlights the distinct worldview of the Book of Enoch, where the divine is wholly other, and any blurring of the lines between the human and the divine is seen as a threat.
Okay, so we've seen how the Book of Enoch is this fascinating blend of ancient myths, religious ideas, and theological interpretations, but it's also sparked some pretty wild theories, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, we got to talk about the fringe stuff.
Let's go there.
So one of the most popular theories is the ancient astronaut theory, which gained traction in the mid-20th century. It basically says that ancient deities were actually aliens visiting Earth.
Like Close Encounters of the Ancient Kind?
Exactly. And people who subscribe to this theory often interpret the Watchers in the Book of Enoch as these very beings, extraterrestrial visitors who came down from the sky and interacted with early humans.
So when the Bible talks about angels descending from heaven, they're like, yep, that's a spaceship.
Basically, yeah, they take it quite literally.
Yeah.
And the advanced knowledge that the Watchers supposedly shared.
Like magic, astrology, weapon making.
That's seen as evidence of alien technology being given to primitive humans.
So instead of divine magic, it's like, here's how to build a laser beam.
Haha, kinda, yeah. The idea is that ancient people, lacking a scientific understanding of the world, would have interpreted these advanced technologies as supernatural powers.
It makes sense in a way, right? If you saw someone flying around in a spaceship, you might think they were a god.
Totally. And what about those giant offspring, the Nephilim? How do they fit into this theory?
I'm guessing they're like alien hybrids.
Bingo. They're often interpreted as the result of interbreeding between these alien Watchers and humans. Like a cosmic genetic experiment gone wrong.
Like the first generation of star children.
Exactly. And some theorists even go as far as to connect the Watchers to the Anunnaki, who are the gods in Sumerian mythology who came down to Earth.
The ones who created humans, right?
Yep, those guys. Figures like Zecharia Sitchin, who wrote a bunch of books about the Anunnaki, have argued that the sons of God in Genesis and the Watchers in Enoch are actually the same beings, extraterrestrial visitors, who jump-started civilization in Mesopotamia.
Whoa, that's a pretty wild connection.
It is. And the word Anuna itself has been interpreted by some as meaning those who came from the spars. So it kind of fits.
It's like connecting the dots between different ancient myths and then adding a sci-fi twist.
Exactly. It's a blend of mythology, archaeology, and a healthy dose of speculation.
Can I remember reading somewhere that even Enoch's ascent to heaven has been interpreted through this alien lens?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Authors like Erich von Däniken, who wrote Chariots of the Gods, have suggested that Enoch's journey to heaven was actually an alien abduction.
Like, he got beamed up, Scotty.
Exactly. They see the descriptions of bright clouds, fiery chariots, and heavenly beings as metaphorical descriptions of spaceships and aliens.
It's a pretty imaginative interpretation, to say the least.
It is. And while these theories aren't accepted by mainstream science, it's fascinating to see how the Book of Enoch, with its talk of advanced knowledge and otherworldly beings, can spark these kinds of imaginative interpretations.
It's like people are trying to make sense of these ancient mysteries using modern frameworks, whether that's science fiction, conspiracy theories, or whatever.
Totally. And that's part of what makes this stuff so engaging. It's a way of connecting the past with the present, of trying to understand how ancient people might have viewed the world through their own cultural lenses.
And it reminds us that our understanding of history is constantly evolving as we discover new information and come up with new ways of interpreting the past. Okay, so let's move on to a slightly more sensitive topic: the relationship between the Book of Enoch and religious authority.
All right, let's tread carefully here.
Yeah, it seems like Enoch's acceptance has been, shall we say, a bit rocky over the centuries.
Understatement of the year. It's been a wild ride, that's for sure.
So, in the early days of Christianity, some pretty influential figures actually held the Book of Enoch in high regard, right?
Yeah, like really high regard. Tertullian, who was this early Christian writer in the late 2nd century, actually considered it scripture.
Whoa, like on the same level as the Gospels?
Yep. He even argued that it was preserved by Noah in the ark, like it was that important. And he claimed that Jewish authorities rejected it because it predicted the coming of the Messiah. So it was already controversial back then.
So it was once considered super important, even canonical by some. But then what happened? Why did it get sidelined?
Well, there was this shift in theological thinking that started happening around the 4th century.
Like the church fathers were like, nah, we're good.
Pretty much. Guys like Irenaeus and Augustine, they came along and offered different interpretations of the sons of God in Genesis. Instead of fallen angels, they said they were just descendants of Seth, one of Adam and Eve's other sons.
So a more human explanation, less supernatural.
Exactly. And that kind of rendered the whole fallen angel story in Enoch unnecessary.
Like, we don't need that anymore.
Yep. And then early church councils, like the Council of Laodicea, they left Enoch off their lists of approved biblical books.
So it went from being seen as scripture by some to being completely excluded.
A pretty dramatic fall from grace.
And it pretty much disappeared from Europe during the Middle Ages, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, it went underground. The fact that there wasn't a Latin translation of it and the church actively discouraged people from reading it meant that it pretty much vanished from Western consciousness.
Like it was erased from history.
It was mainly preserved in the Ethiopian church, which is why we have those Giza translations. And even when European travelers rediscovered Enoch manuscripts in Ethiopia in the 18th century, there was a lot of skepticism.
Like, is this thing even real?
Some scholars thought they were forgeries, It was just too out there for them to accept. The content itself, with all the talk of fallen angels and giants, it just didn't fit with the prevailing religious beliefs of the time.
It was too spicy for the 18th century.
Yeah, too much for them to handle. And then we have the whole Dead Sea Scrolls saga, which is a story in itself. The discovery of those Enoch fragments was huge, but the delay in publishing them was incredibly controversial.
Like, what was the holdup?
Well, after the initial discovery, control over the scrolls was basically in the hands of a small team of scholars, and access for other researchers was severely restricted for decades. And one of the key figures on this team was Roland de Vaux, a Dominican priest who was close to the Catholic Church.
So the church had a lot of influence over what got published and what didn't.
It definitely raises some eyebrows. And scholars like Robert Eisenman have claimed that they were actively denied access to the scrolls, suggesting that there was a deliberate attempt to suppress information that might challenge the church's doctrines.
Like, don't let anyone see